when they shut off the music, like, whew, sucks the air right out. So, welcome everybody. It's a bird, it's a plane, kind of funny. But we're going to be talking about a new issue for a lot of people, but we're also going to be talking about how this issue is exploding. Okay, but before we get started, please remember to turn off your cell phones. And I would also urge you, if you haven't been on the vendor floor, to take the time to visit the vendors, even if you're not buying, but at least thank them for coming. It's out of their pocket that the events like this are possible. And just take the time to say thank you. I know they'd appreciate it. Okay. 3 years ago, I was at NAB, National Association of Broadcasters, and there were a few vendors that were showing drones. 2 years ago, there were a lot more scattered. Last year, they had a whole area defined just for that, but yet a lot of vendors still were scattered throughout the trade show. You could see something was going on. The drones were getting smaller, they were getting cheaper, the cameras were getting more efficient and getting smaller and lighter, so you have payload issues of being able to buy smaller. So what we knew in the industry back when the movie people were using them, as well as law enforcement and utilities, but you were talking about $50,000 units. So there was no real threat or impact within the community. Now it's a $1,000 unit. Now some people think they're toys. Now the sales of them in this past year have been phenomenal. There are universities now that will train and license because there are jobs in this area for anywhere between $50,000 and $250,000. So as I approach my retirement, maybe I've got a second life for employment. You'll see a lot more publications about them. You're seeing them in sports now. There are drone racing going on. Okay, ESPN will premiere that next month. So now you have drones that are traveling over 100 miles an hour. Okay, so we're starting to look at, so here we have safety issues. Okay, we have in the arts, I don't know how many of you watch some of the competitions and what have you, but there are now dances using drones as partners within the dances. Okay, in the music industry, they're flying drones over conferences, in business, this morning, I saw a commercial for a chimney sweep that said, "Invite our drone in to take a look." What? So this is what's going on. So the question, and the big one, I think no matter how big we may or may not have a wall between us and Mexico, drone trafficking via drone is going over the top. So it appears that in very short order, you may have a landing pad in your yard that's going to be just like your mailbox on the front of your house. So they said in 2014, they predicted 10,000 commercial licenses by 2018. So the question we'll be talking about is, so what's going to happen to the airspace? So look at how many vehicles. Look what could potentially happen. December 17, 2015, FAA produced state and local regulation on unmanned aircraft systems. Fact sheet said, unmanned aircraft systems are aircraft subject to regulations by the FAA to ensure safety of flight and safety to people and property on the ground. State and local jurisdiction are increasingly exploring regulations on UAS and looking to enact legislation. In 2015, approximately 45 states had already considered legislation. In addition, public comments on the FAA's proposed rules for operation expressed a concern about the possible impact on state and local laws. Joining us today is Mark Gibson, or Hoot, as we've learned. He's a former Major General flying F-16s for the Air Force, senior advisor to the UAS integration, a position established to focus on the external outreach and education, interagency initiatives, and enterprise-level approach to FAA management. And he'll be our first speaker. The next panelist I met at the Government Expo in Washington, D.C. She was a keynote speaker at the Jersey Access Group's conference this past year. At the conference, I asked her if she would be willing to do a workshop after she spoke to discuss with our attendees what their concerns were, that she had a better understanding of what we need to learn about and the problems that we see on the horizon. Christina Engh is Army Reserve Black Hawk pilot and Brigade USA advisor. She's got 20 years of military experience and deployment to Iraq and Afghanistan. She's a former FAA contractor and has extensive knowledge on UAS. JAG has been working with our third panelist, Ken Fellman, for a number of years, and I called Ken when I was talking to Christina, and asked if he could help me in kind of putting this workshop together. Well, it worked out that Ken was actually, he said, I'm looking at this kind of stuff right now. I'd love to be involved. That panel developed, and it was a very exciting panel that we had, and the conversations, I hope, will be much like the ones we'll have today and raise a lot of questions for you. Ken has, like the other two, our other two panelists, Ken has also spent a lot of time on aircraft in the air. He was a passenger. But you can see there's some similarities between our three panelists. You know, they all are familiar with airspace. Ken's practice is involved with government regulations and deals with public utilities, and I guess I can assume now, Ken, that it's also involved with the integration of UAS. So before we get started, I want to just take a moment to thank both Hoot and Christina for their service. Please. So now, please welcome Hoot Gibson.
Okay, it's still good morning. Good morning, everyone. As Rich pointed out, I'm in a new position. In fact, today I think is the exact one-year point. The new position is Senior Advisor on UAS Integration, and I report directly to the Deputy up on the 10th floor. So it's been an exciting year. I have a background, as he mentioned, in the military that started with UAVs in Iraq in 2003, continued through, and then my last assignment in the Pentagon is Current Ops and Training Director for the Air Force. Got very involved, in fact, started a new career field, and we knew this was not a fad and began working with the FAA at that point. So it's interesting to find myself back 8 years later on the 10th floor saying it's really not a fad. Karma. So a couple things. I'm just going to tee some things up for you. I mean, I could be up here for a long time, as Rich alluded. If you're not in this game every day, in this space, you might not grasp the explosion and the potential that it represents. There's a lot of folks that do. I mentioned to him, I'll touch on it at the end, but we just had our first meeting of something called the Drone Advisory Council. And we had over 400 C-suite applicants to participate in that, and got it down to 35, which was very difficult. It includes things like The chairman is Brian Krasanich, the CEO of Intel, and folks of that caliber. So to come on board and work with the FAA as we move forward and helping us to prioritize our strategy and our efforts. So some things I know you'll all be interested in is rulemaking. How do we do that? It's a rather arcane science. Just remember that we are a public regulatory body, so there's a lot of statute that tells us what we have to do because, again, our airspace is a public resource. And that you'll see come into play in a number of my answers probably later on. Just some of the things that are currently out there. We mentioned the small rule and the growth. To point, we are well above over 500,000 registrants in about, 8 months. And each of those is thought will have 2 or 3 vehicles that belongs to them. On the other side, we have about 320,000 registered traditional operators in aircraft, and it took us nearly 100 years to get to that point. So it's a big deal. UAS security is the other side, frankly, that's beginning to develop. Obviously, we're going to have swarms. Some think these are going to darken our skies, but security and privacy, I know, is on everybody's mind, and I'll touch on that briefly. And then just some of the things that we've done here recently from the FAA. Again, the reason I'm here to talk to you today, a lot of people, but this, for folks that have been involved in aviation, I don't hesitate to say that this is the most fundamental change in aviation in our lifetime. Some would say jet engines and stuff. No, this is fundamentally different. No one in the cockpit. You operate it remotely, and all the things that go with that, both safety and other concerns. But again, having been around it for a while, right now we're focused on the small aircraft. Amazon wants their delivery. Google wants to be able to do things. But also don't forget, it covers all the intermediate altitudes and larger vehicles. And I think the next explosion in this will be the very high altitude. Companies like Facebook are involved to put these things up, example for LTE or Wi-Fi repeaters in the near space, what I call near space, 60 to 70,000 feet. So it covers a wide array of things. The small and low altitude is the current buzz. Again, FAA authority. We get our authority from Title 49. It says that we have the job of controlling and running a safe operation in our national airspace. And therefore, things that we are doing now with that involve that. One of the things it says that we can regulate aircraft. UAS are considered an aircraft. I know a lot of folks like to just think about it, I just want to go fly my toy or my kite. These things go up to 10,000. They're mixing in airspace where we will all be operating a manned aircraft, and so it has to be regulated, and we have to make sure that the folks that are operating in that space jointly with manned understand what they're doing and what the impact could be. So hence we're regulating, and we're also demanding a certain amount of structure to that and certification of the operators so they people don't get hurt. Small UAS rule just came out, and the process of rulemaking, again, comes back to the fact that we're a public regulatory body, and when we put things up that are going to significantly alter, change that national resource called airspace, there are a number of constituencies involved, obviously those that like and those that don't like what we're proposing. And after we collect our data, we put that out in what's called an NPRM, Notice of Prior Rulemaking, and we collect comments. The 107 was out, I think, for about 4 months, and it took us probably 8 to reconcile over 10,000 comments, and we do have to address every comment that comes back on that and respond to it. So anyway, we finally got through that process, and the rule became active on August 29th of this year. And you mentioned there might be as many in 2018, 10,000 operators. We have passed that already this year in the few short months that we've had. So again, I think folks are trying to keep up with where we really at on this. It's hard enough, and I'm in the building, So some basics of the 107 operating rules. Some of you know that we're involved in this, that we had an exemption process called 333 from the 2012 language from Congress saying we should enable some of this industry and the growth. We received over 12,000 applicants. It's a legal process to get exempted from the rules that are out there. We ended up with over 5,000 approved, and we still had 8,000 in the queue when the rule came out. Most of those exemptions were now covered by the rule. So as long as you comply with the rule, they were sent, we triaged them, and we sent letters back to over nearly 8,000 saying, the rule is out. Based on your exemption request, you can operate now under 107. There was a small stack of them in there that weren't quite compliant with 107, and we can waive those, which is a much easier process in a different part of the FAA. But also, even with that, I think there was another 15 to 20 of the thousands that still would require an exemption to fly under the current existing rule. Suffice it to say, it's for commercial operators. If you're a hobbyist, that's covered by 336, Section 336 of the 2012 enactment, congressional law. But otherwise, if you want to have a commercial operation, you follow under 107. 107 says basically day in line of sight. You would think that doesn't enable, but when you think about real estate, you think about insurance, you think about certain inspections, tunnels, you think about Wi-Fi towers, there's already quite a bit of applicability of this, and think of it as a tool. You go up, you open your Pelican case, and you use it in that sense, and it saves you time, risks, people at risk, more safe. In many cases, a better evaluation. So there's a lot of folks out there doing it. We've also granted nearly 100, I'm sure by this point, waivers to this rule. The first day we came out with over 70, and most of those have involved operations at night. So this permits you to operate 20 or 30 minutes prior to sunrise and after sunset if you have the appropriate lighting. If you're really going to be operating at night, it will require a waiver, but we're granting most of those. How do you get a waiver? Just real quickly, we have it on our website, FAA/UAS.gov. You can go in there, and there's all kinds of good information. In there will be a waiver portal that you can fill out the information. And it's not really fully automated yet, but someone will get back to you for your application and do any clarifications that they need to consider your waiver request. These are some things, like I said, that are waiverable under the rule, which waiverable, again, just for the uninitiated, really means it's just a much more simplified process. Comes from our flight standards office, not through essentially general counsel for exemptions. So these will continue to grow. The other thing that we see in this is as we waive for beyond visual line of sight at night, that's going to become our next stage of what we call expanded operations, which will, the next real thing that will make these commercially viable is being able to operate beyond visual line of sight. And we're working hard to get there, but it'll be a while yet. This is the second rule that's out for consideration right now. It was originally called the micro rule because they thought a small vehicle would be the way that we would categorize them. It's really more clearly operations, safe operations over people. And you can mitigate the risk not just with weight, but by the design of the vehicle. I mean, you can think Nerf, think things that, will cover the fans and those kinds of things. So there's going to be about 3 tiers coming out. This is supposed to be prepared to go to the public for comment by the end of the year. There'll be a public comment period, like I mentioned earlier, and we're thinking this rule will be out by next summer. Expanded operations, I mentioned that, and that's really when we get into the next commercial realm. This just shows how one builds upon the other. We started with Section 333, and then we moved through 107, and we just continue to expand. The goal, the long-term goal, is truly integrated air operations. And again, that's not just smalls, but that's small, that's medium altitude, medium-sized vehicles, large vehicles at high altitude, and how they'll be able to operate in a non-segregated way from manned aircraft. My background in the military, I can tell you we have a different risk model, clearly, and we're pushed by an adversary to do things. If we don't take risk, we have problems. In this, we're a little bit risk-averse, but we've been operating manned and unmanned forward in Afghanistan and elsewhere routinely, and we don't shut the airport down. We sequence them in for landing. We sequence them for takeoff. A lot of people aren't aware of that, but that's been going on for years, safely. So it can be done. UAS security, this is the stuff that a lot of folks are now starting to realize could be problematic. If you're going to have a lot of these things out there, how do you regulate it? How do you protect the public from it? there's two words up here, privacy and preemption. We don't, in the traditional sense, touch on the privacy issue in the FAA. It's not really our lane. However, we know that privacy and operations are related. And so a lot of folks are coming up saying, I want a no-fly zone, no drone zone in my, over the ballpark or over the school or whatever it's going to be. And what they're really saying is we want to, make sure it's safe, but also in many cases, I don't want my privacy violated, which could happen. We are working feverishly on those 2 points. Preemption means that in the past, when we started aviation, there were concerns about aircraft, and we were killing the turkeys on the turkey farmer and doing all that stuff. Those years have come through, and a million little case and case law have defined where we are today in the traditional aircraft. Fortunately or unfortunately, UAS, being so unique in its flight characteristics, now has opened a new seam of concern where aviation touches people's lives on the ground. And so, as you can imagine, I was in a meeting yesterday all afternoon with something called the XCOM, and that's my federal partners. DOJ is in there, Justice and others. And this is very hotly debated right now, how to move forward in this, frankly, new reality. So a lot of work going on that. We in the FAA are coming up with what I think are some pretty creative solutions to this. Lack of a better word, we will look to push a lot of the low altitude, meaning really low altitude stuff, to local communities for them to take it up in their town hall rather than us trying to, address the over 3,000 counties in this country. So we'll see what comes of that. It should be in the next 6 months. 2209 is the section in the current continuance language for us. And I put up here airspace control measures. It's all kinds of things. Again, we just touched on it, but a number of folks are very concerned right now. DOD about overflight and surveillance, DOE with all their sites, energy, nuclear facilities. Department of Interior is very concerned in some areas about what folks are going to be doing with these. So it doesn't necessarily say we accept all that. It says in the law, prepare a process for the Secretary of Transportation that folks can apply through to seek protected airspace. And we're working on that. Again, the test there is, that's also good for commerce and for this industry, so there's a put and take in every decision that we'll be making. 2206 is a pilot program. That just means that's where it started. Most of you have heard about concerns of these operating in and around airports. It's very real. We haven't done any actual, throwing these down engines, but I pretty much feel it wouldn't be a good thing. Lithium batteries, I don't volunteer for that duty, thank you. But we have done already some significant modeling through some of our testing with our Center of Excellence, and the modeling predicts that it would not be a good thing. So currently I'm very involved in this. I've been working it since February with the team, both interagency and within the building, on how to detect these in and around airports in a cost-effective fashion. A lot of technology already out there because DOD has been concerned with this for a long time forward. So we continue to move along there. I will point out, I was talking to Rich earlier, there's Title 18 that says you can't shoot down airplanes. I think that goes back to the time when people didn't like airplanes, but there were people in them. And so Department of Justice and others are trying to figure out how do we amend that, can we amend that, how do we go to the Hill and explain what kind of relief we'll need now in, again, this new reality. Oh, sorry, there we go. Key focus areas, it's just real quick, one slide and I'm almost done. It says, we realized at the FAA that, we had to change. My position in hiring me is one. My colleague and counterpart within the Office of Integration is another, but it's been a bit of a sea state change. I talked to Christina, who used to work there, and we've seen the same path, and I think in the last 12 months, things have changed significantly. Cultural change, most people say, we're going from analog to digital. I would tell you we're going from paper to digital. It's a very significant change, and data is going to crush us as we move through this because we're trying to move to real-time, dynamic information on airspace and such. That's the number one challenge right now. Organizational change, I touched on that, and community partnering, I touched on the DAC. So these are just some of the things. We talked about the registration, small UAS rule, the micro rule. Unfortunately, somebody called it the OOPS rule. You didn't hear it here. UAS board, I mentioned we've organized within the headquarters to focus on the UAS concerns more broadly. And again, the hiring of me and my colleague Earl Lawrence. And then down at the bottom, I mentioned the DAC, the Drone Advisory Committee, had its inaugural meeting last Friday. A lot of significant leadership there to help us. And the XCOM is the counterpart to the industry, and that is the meeting I mentioned that I was in yesterday. I chair that, and that's where we have 8 of the secretarial level, so DHS, DOD, NASA, DOC, DOI, DOE was there. So a lot of folks, a lot of hot federal issues that are involved right now in this. And so I'll come back to questions, and that's me and my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you, Hoot. Our next 2 panelists, Christina and Ken, are going to work together in their presentation, and so I ask you now to please welcome them.
So thank you, Rich, and thank you, Hoot, for starting this out with this. And I want to thank everybody in the audience for attending NATOA and coming down here, and everybody who's listening on the web. And if this is being recorded, if you have any questions afterwards, we know this, like I said, it's being recorded, and some people are listening on the web, so we are prepared for that. Hoot covered a lot of the areas that we will have on our slides, so we'll quickly go through those. We'll because a lot of this is overlap and a lot of cross information. We're going to get a little bit more into the weeds. Because this is recorded and because the slides will be available, feel free to just listen in and not have to take notes, because we have a lot of slides. We're going to be pretty quick. We're going to try to shotgun style this and get through some of this information.
Yeah, and I would just say, from a purely local government standpoint, we're really talking about two big issues: local government as users of unmanned aircrafts, and local governments as regulators. So we're going to talk about both of those as we go through these slides.
All right, perfect.
So this list is really not the comprehensive full list of what our interests are, but it's a list that's growing. And the more time that we think about potential uses, the longer this list is going to get. So we're happy to take your suggestions of what we should add to the list the next time we do one of these presentations.
Yeah, and I was talking to Hoot earlier. There almost isn't an industry that unmanned aircraft doesn't touch today. There's only been 2 industries that I've been able to come up with, and one is cosmetology and hairdressing. And I think the other one, and I don't even remember what the other one was. I think I probably came up with a reason to use it. But seriously, think about it and think about what industries are out there, and you will be able to find a use case scenario for an unmanned aircraft for virtually every single industry. And if you'd like to challenge me, please come. I'll figure it out for you. So the next slides, we're going to talk about local governments as operators. Like Ken said, you both want to use them, right? Local governments want to use them, but they also want to protect their citizens from other people who are using them.
Yeah, these are just the basics. I mean, Hoot covered some of this. We've got new rules under Part 107, so should probably just skip through this one.
Yeah, and so one of the things that, like Hoot said, a lot of people consider this the commercial rule, right? And there's been talk within FAA also that they call it the visual line of sight rule, actually, because even though you're going to have a majority of commercial operators operating underneath this, you can also have your public operators operating underneath this, which are not necessarily commercial operations. And later on, we're going to get into first-person view flying, which is inherently a hobby and recreation. However, it's kind of debated, but right now the FAA has made it very clear that they will have to operate under Part 107 right now. So it's not just for commercial applications, it's really kind of the visual line of sight rule. So that's one thing that we, want to, it's kind of gray still, but that's where it's at. So 49 CFR Part 107 basics. Public operators can operate under the new Part 107 regulations, and this is important to the audience members right now because a majority of the audience members are public operators. So you need to determine, which is one of the things that you can determine in-house, you can talk to us, and we work those use case scenarios to determine what's best for your operation as to whether or not you can or want to or need to operate under Part 107 versus what's called a public COA. Most public unmanned aircraft needs will be met by Part 107, and eventually we talk about this later on, the FAA wants everybody operating under Part 107 as best as you can. So eventually these public COAs won't be needed because we will be able to really operate under Part 107. If you have an existing COA and exemption, you can continue operating under those exemptions. There's a need to switch to 107 or renew your exemption before the existing authorization expires. One thing that was put out was, unlike public operators who can operate under both the public COA and Part 107, depending on your needs, as long as you're operating as a civil operator, it was put out that commercial operators who are operating who are operating under their exemption cannot operate under both their exemption, under their what's called a 333 exemption, and Part 107. You have to make a decision. Oh, I think I'm like just starting to switch this. Are we good?
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Okay. So again, some of these issues were addressed earlier by Hoot, but 107, you continue to use these for hobbies and recreation, first responder uses. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more later when we get into the local government as a regulator, but the new rules under Part 107 have specific language preserving local government authority. There were a number of comments filed that were seeking pretty much complete preemption of local authority by the federal government. And unlike some of the experience we've had at another agency that will go unnamed, the FAA has some language in the new rules that actually respected the and recognizes, probably a better word, the important local public safety regulations that should continue to apply. But when we get into that section of the presentation that talks about these rules and a new statute, you'll see that even that is still in the gray area. Just know that you do have some local authority, and each of our jurisdictions ought to be looking at how to best utilize that.
And the FAA did put out a memo that discusses that and talks about how you, as local, in the local jurisdiction, kind of a framework, how do they want you to go about it. And the most important thing, which we talk about later in here also, is really they want you to work with the FAA to make sure that you are in compliance with federal laws, state laws. You don't go outside, what is your jurisdiction and what you can and cannot do. And this is where we're going to get into federal preemption, but the FAA is kind of punting on federal preemption right now and trying to figure out what exactly do we need to do, what do they need to do, and what are these left and right limits, because it is such a new technology and we're not really sure what needs to be done. Pilot information, the new pilot position. This is what was really cool, is they changed it in the Part 107 to a remote pilot in command. Under the notice of proposed rulemaking, they had referred to them as operators, and I want to make this really important. The FAA has decided that indeed the people who are flying these unmanned aircraft are pilots. You are pilots. You're not an operator. You're not an RC hobbyist anymore. You're a pilot, and as a pilot, embrace it, enjoy it, and be a part of this community, and don't try to step outside of it and say, oh no, I'm not a pilot. You are a pilot, and the FAA has said you are a pilot. You just have a different name. You're called a remote pilot, and that's really important. I think that really justified the people who have been flying these for a long time, who've wanted to say, but I am a pilot. So embrace that. Another thing, that unmanned aircraft can be flown by someone without a certificate if they're directly supervised by somebody who has the 107 certificate as a pilot in command, but they have to be able to take immediate control of the unmanned aircraft. This is important with public operators because you can get one person who's certified as your 107 operator, and maybe somebody who's better on the controls, or somebody who works your camera better, whatever that is, can be the person who's flying that, so long as your 107 operator is there to supervise and can take those controls in case of an emergency. The remote piloting command cannot supervise more than one unmanned aircraft at a time. Like Hoot said, we'll show later on, that is waiverable. And the remote piloting command can deviate from Part 107 if required by an emergency, but must supply a written justification to the FAA after the flight. And remember, just like in manned aviation, the remote piloting command has ultimate authority. It's a lot of responsibility to look at what is going on in the situation that you're at while you're flying, and to make those hard decisions during an emergency situation. You have to take the controls from maybe somebody who's your boss or somebody who's senior to you or whatever. If you're that Part 107 piloting command, this is your time, and when you have to decide that it's an emergency and you can deviate from these rules and regulations to ensure safety of the national airspace. And so there's something called advocacy and assertion. You got to be able to say, I'm taking the flight controls right now, and land that aircraft or do what you need to do to keep the national airspace safe. You can read that slide.
Yeah,
It's on there. We can.
yeah, I would,
Quick.
let me just ask, show of hands, how many of you actually have somebody in your, who's employed by your local government who is operating an unmanned aircraft? All right, I'm not going to ask if you're licensed, because Hoot would have to arrest you if you're not. How many of you are contracting with third-party companies to do it for you? So to me, what's important about these new rules is that you got to go back and look over your contracts that you were using before. You have to be careful with your new contracts and ensure that the companies that you're retaining are fully compliant with all of these regulations. So I look at this from a legal standpoint, and how do we protect the local government from liability. We've got new rules. When we're out there working with companies who are providing this service for us, we have to make sure they're compliant. And this kind of follows the same thing. It's an amusing slide, but really, if you have a license and you want to keep it, and if you want to avoid liability for your local government, and personal liability perhaps for yourself, this is one of those duh slides, but don't forget it.
All right, so operational limitations. So the national airspace is broken up into different airspace classifications. It's kind of this, you have to think about it in this three-dimensional world. And it's really important to understand as you move forward and get your Part 107 certificates and you start operating the national airspace, that when we talk about don't fly in Class C airspace or don't fly in Class Surface Lateral E airspace, it's not where you're located. It's where the aircraft is located. So you might be in what we consider Class G airspace, which is where we're all really authorized to fly right now. But if you're inspecting a cell tower that is at 2,000 feet and the Class C surface area, I think maybe there's not. I was looking for a.
There's a laser on it, but it may not work. That's it right there.
That's what I thought. Okay, so if you're inspecting a cell tower and you're in Class G airspace, which you're allowed to fly in right here, but your cell tower is 2,000 feet, and you want to fly 400 feet above that because you can fly 400 feet above a structure, you might be up here in this Class C airspace, which you don't have authorization to fly in. So when we talk about thinking about this in a 3D, in a very three-dimensional world, that's why you have to understand your airspace. And that's really important. And don't just memorize these maps in order for you to take the test. It's more than just memorizing the maps. It's understanding the practical application as to how it affects your operation. That is really important. And that's why we recommend don't just go online and study this information. Get somebody to teach it to you, and get somebody to teach you and your organization and the people that are flying for your organization to make sure that you understand how this affects you. So no operation in Class A airspace. I know there are always but I know somebody or the military is flying there. These are more for 107 operators. We're low, right? The operations in the other air in B, C, D, and lateral boundaries of E. The FAA is working with air traffic controllers and the owners of the controllers of that airspace to determine where can we really fly, what's really going on. There's going to be a web portal eventually where you can go in there and you can ask for these certain, for this authorization to fly in this airspace. But for those of you who have really good relationships with your airport managers and your airport facilities, you're no longer going to be able to just call them up and ask to get into that airspace. It's going to have to go through the FAA right now and through headquarters. So that relationship now is going to change a little bit. So just be aware of that part. Max altitude 400 feet above ground unless you're within 400 feet of a structure.
Right, so there are a number of limitations that you need to be aware of. You can only operate one at a time. The operations over people, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but Hoot mentioned that you can get waivers, right? So no operations over people. Well, you know, your government access channel wants to film the big parade or festival or whatever it is that you're doing. How do you avoid going over people? How do you get one of these waivers? I mean, Hoot pointed out there's going to be, you know, on the website an opportunity to get waivers. I'm not sure, maybe Christina or Hoot want to weigh in on how long is it going to take so you can plan properly to get your waivers. These are some of the issues that when I talk to my colleagues who are doing the PEG operations that we're looking at, and of course some, you know, may not be aware of this stuff. This is critically important. We're going to talk about enforcement later. The FAA is enforcing these things, so you do not want to end up in FAA jail for violating these regulations.
Hoot, do you know how long it takes to get a waiver? It's on a case-by-case basis, I know.
Right. The goal right now is 90 days. So if you want to fly, build in 90 days. We think we can, we will drop below that, but right now we're not sure. We're getting a lot of waiver requests. Will that be a tidal wave and then subside once we get to normalcy? But 90 days is the goal, and there'll be an exchange of information. And briefly on the flight over people, 107 changed a little bit where we were before, where you needed 500 feet offset.
Right.
Now it just says do not fly directly over people. So you do have some relief with all these cameras. They can reach a bit, but the other rule, as I mentioned, will be out by next summer, and that will actually permit certain types of aircraft to operate directly over. The reason is because science has been done that it's less than 1% potential for serious injury. It's the abbreviated injury standards and stuff. So it was the best they could do on a scientific basis, but it will permit, by next summer, we think the rule will be out, permit direct operations over based on type of aircraft.
The other bullet point on this slide that I wanted to mention, just again, because I'm focused on how to avoid liability, the last one about you can self-certify, the pilot can self-certify that he or she is in good physical and mental health. If you are a supervisor, or if you're the pilot, but you got to make sure that you're doing that accurately. It is not that difficult, you can imagine, to sort of omit something that might be a little bit embarrassing. Then you have an accident and you have a problem. If you have, there are no lawsuits out there that I'm aware of right now, but if you self-certify, and you better make sure that your folks are doing it accurately. And again, if you're hiring a company to do it, your contract needs to be airtight on what happens if there was inaccurate reporting to make sure that the local government doesn't incur new liability here.
One point, if I can just follow up. Folks, do we have any traditional aviators in the group, aircraft?
Whoop, whoop.
Yep, whoop, whoop, whoop. You know, we don't walk out and stand beside you. You've been certified, you've taken your check rides and all that. We're trying to get that same sense of professionalism and responsibility. So if you go out, like Ken said, and screw up, you will be held accountable. We're trying to get that same kind of mindset in this form of aviation as we've had for a long time in the other form of aviation.
So airworthiness and registration, the FAA airworthiness certification is not required right now. However, we do know that as we move forward, there might be instances where you do need an airworthiness requirement of some sort. We don't know what that looks like yet. We don't know if it's going to be the case. But eventually, there very easily could be an airworthiness requirement for certain operations. The operator must maintain a small U.S. in condition for safe operation. Aircraft registration is required, and you do have to put aircraft markings on your aircraft. One of the things we want to talk about, as a public operator, if you do, this is one of the big parts when you decide to operate under Part 107 as a civil operator. This is really where it affects you, is now you have to make sure that you are within you're compliant with Part 107, and that includes aircraft markings and registration.
All right, so we know there's going to be a lot of cargo delivery. The graphic that you probably can't read, what the tweet on the upper right-hand corner, that was my attempt to try to appease NATOA President Jody Miller, who like me, is a big Star Wars fan. I don't think Jody's in the room, and I couldn't find a Yoda photo, but it says first look at Amazon's new delivery drone, also helpful for finding rebel bases on Hoth.
So carriage of cargo, once again, we're going to go ahead and go past this slide. You can go ahead and look at it, and during the slide presentation, it's pretty straightforward. We do have to say one thing about the no hazmat. Part 1, it's considered 49 CFR Part 137, which is basically covers your crop dusters. You're looking at spraying of cargo. So, I'm sorry, spraying of hazmat. So even though it says no hazmat, that means no hazmat carrying, as in Amazon recently getting fined for sending hazmat through the FedEx channels and not listing exactly what it is. We're talking like actual hazmat on the aircraft. However, we know that they're using unmanned aircraft now to spray for the Zika virus. Public entities are using that. We have a client who's doing that. So when we talk about hazmat, this Part 137 is still in effect. And when you look at that, the rules and regulations there are very different. It has more stringent operations and requirements on the pilot, such as still needing a pilot's license right now. So just know that just because you fall under Part 107 doesn't mean that you don't necessarily fall under other regulations.
Just as an aside, I've been trading emails yesterday and today on some companies that are come in with 137 requests, and they're being worked. Larger aircraft, in this case it had to do with Forestry Service, but, and to your point on Star Wars, Ken, I'm remind everybody the opening scene was about drones in agriculture. Right. We're there. We are there.
We are. And BVLOS, that's beyond visual line of sight. I'm going to make clear of two things. So we have line of sight right now, which is where you can see the aircraft and you can clear the airspace around you. The next thing that people talk about is extended line of sight, and that's where you can't really make out the aircraft, yet you can still clear the airspace around the aircraft. Beyond visual line of sight, can't see the aircraft, can't clear the airspace around it. So make clear that, we have three different steps within line of sight requirements. Oh, did I go? There we go. All right, AMA modelers. Oh, I'm going to get this one, I guess. All right, so this is what we're going to say about AMA. So, Section 101, there's going to be new verbiage out there that talks about modelers. So AMA and the FAA, they, for lack of a better word, they kind of just keep slapping each other. No, we're right. No, you're right. No. And if you go onto the AMA website, they're going to say first-person view personnel don't need can operate under modeling. However, you get the official FAA word, and they say no. First-person view personnel need to operate under Part 107, and then you send that to the AMA, and the AMA says no, the FAA is wrong, and then so what we want to make clear with some of these slides, and AMA, for those who don't know, it's the Academy of Model Aeronautics. They've been around forever.
80 years.
80 years, yeah. They have 2,500 community-based organizations, and forever, this is how modelers have operated. They've operated under AMA. It's really the only thing that we've had as modelers. And now there's this area where modelers are crossing over into commercial, and commercial over into modelers, and these rules and regulations are starting to cross over one another. So they're kind of at a head with one another. The recommendation that I make is, which is on this next slide, AMA is not a regulating authority. So you can either have your friends at AMA tell you, oh, you guys are fine, you don't need to operate under Part 107 for FPV flying. You can take their word for it, or you can contact the regulators who are actually the ones who are interpreting the rule and writing the rule, and ask for their advice, which says, yes, indeed, you have to operate under Part 107 because you cannot meet the line of sight requirements.
I also have been exchanging many emails with my brothers and sisters at AMA. I drew the short straw last year to go out to their annual convention. Yeah, that was fun. But, in the end, half that community is traditional pilots, and it was an hour and a half of Q&A, and then they drug my bloody carcass off the stage. But I had to agree to go fly with them so I could understand what they were doing. But they eventually agreed to register. The 336 comes from, they're politically astute. They had Congress essentially protect them, the modelers, but there is a lot of overlap, as Christina pointed out, and we continue to work with them because in many ways they're another arm out there that are very responsible and have been for a long time, and they do have certain standards. We call them community-based safety standards. So there's a lot of goodness by having them in the tent than outside the tent. And so we work that very, very hard.
NATOA actually had to sign a contract with Hoot, promising him he would have more fun here than he had at the AMA.
Which was a pretty low
conference.
bar, I might
I
add.
know, right?
So, and the reference on the slide to the federal court case is that there's litigation pending currently to address just this issue, is whose interpretation is correct. So going forward, we may have a little bit more direction from people in black robes as to where these rules really fall.
Yeah, and as Sue mentioned earlier, because this is so new, we don't have any court cases. We don't have a lot of federal court cases that we can fall back on. So we're this is coming out as we move forward, as this is in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. We have all of these not all of these court cases, but we have a couple of court cases that are trying to define, there are going to be these defining moments in unmanned aircraft, but we're just waiting. Because we haven't had it before, right? Because we don't have 100 years of this like we do with manned aviation. So it's really fun. And a friend of mine actually at the FAA said, be sure to keep your seatbelts on because this is going to be a turbulent ride. So we do have this. I love this. This is directly from an email from the FAA about FPV flying. This is cut and pasted directly from the email. I am more than welcome to share it. This is the official stance on the FAA. You have the slide there. It does say FPV operators under 107. And why is this important for everybody in the audience? Well, because these are the people who are flying in your city parks. These are the people who are coming out and starting to do FPV racing. There are a lot of organizations. There seems to be a lot of money involved in this. Like I said before, ESPN is getting involved. Miami Dolphins, the owner of the Miami Dolphins has been involved in this. There's a lot of money involved in this. So you're going to see more and more often these FPV racing, in your community. And that's why it's important.
If you wonder about the 107, they are amateurs, hobbyists. And again, I've had plenty of conversations on this and phone calls. The one that was most recent that I spoke in depth with them was up at Governor's Island. The folks that are doing that, I think sincerely are trying to do it safely. They have web netting all around the track and things like that to protect against flyaways. Only certain participants are involved in that, but typically, again, they're operating as hobbyists. So I think they want to come out of that. But, the guy says, well, we're amateurs. And I said, yeah, the Olympics are amateurs. People make a lot of money off of it. But so they may or may not choose to come over. This bit about, though, I was talking to Rich earlier today. I mean, we are in the barnstorming era, and folks don't know what they don't want to know. So it's not to say that there aren't folks out there doing things that are way off off course, operating in parks and things that they shouldn't be. We will continue to work with law enforcement and with the aviation community to become self-policing because somebody asked me at my last presentation up in Ohio, well, how do you guys know? I said, well, we do have 10,000 field agents out there. After everybody went like this, I went, no, I'm just kidding. We don't. We depend on local law enforcement and on, the responsible folks out there to rein that in or bring it to our attention. We do have laws that we can then pursue, but typically we're not the one out there tapping on somebody's shoulder.
All right, so FPV, dead horse, I think we have it figured out. If you have any questions, we have the slides up. So public operators, this is really what you guys are what people out here in the audience are most interested in. So I'll let you take this slide there, Ken. It's legal stuff.
Well, I will tell you because I am still somewhat new to this. So the first bullet point references a federal statute, the sections 40102 and 125, and public operators can be under 107. Actually, I would probably defer to Christina or Hoot to talk more about the 102 and the 125 regulations, because basically we have the old set of regulations, we have the new rules. You're going to have to decide which one you want to be under, and there is potential liability for making the wrong decision or thinking you're operating under one when you're actually operating under the other. So
yeah, so our firm our company has come up with a thing where anytime you go to perform an operation, if you're a public entity, and you elect to sometimes operate under Part 107, and you also have what's called a public COA, Certificate of Authorization or Waiver from the FAA, that at the top of your safety risk assessment, you just have a checkbox, a box, and it says you're either operating under Part 107 or Section 333. I'm sorry, or a public COA, I know that. And so that way, in case something does happen and there is an investigation, they can come out, you can say, listen, we were operating under Part 107. This was what was signed off as a safety assessment. We were operating under Part 107, or we were indeed operating under a public COA. It's one of the things that is really difficult sometimes for public operators to determine what is best for their organization. This 107 versus public COA. We recommend just give us a call. We'll work through this with you and give you those left and rights as to what's probably best for you. But you do have to get a letter from your state attorneys general stating that you are indeed a public operator. All right, once again, ops over human beings, we beat that to death, right? We already know that. If you have any questions, pending, we're figuring it out. Right now, you cannot operate over the person directly over top of you. All right, here we go. So ops over human beings, we've done that. Accident reporting requirements, it states in the new rule and the old reporting requirements under NTSB what you need to do. So you do have to report if you have an accident, which is really important. Enforcement, we've talked about this. You want to talk about the penalty real quick?
Well, one of the issues is there's enforcement at the FAA level, but the FAA has the ability to defer to local jurisdictions to do the enforcement. What's not clear is if your locality is doing the enforcement, who keeps the penalties?
Yeah. And the important thing is this was updated legislation as well, but the FAA may assess civil penalties up to $27,500 for each incident, and criminal penalties include fines of up to $250,000 and 3 years in prison for each incident. So if you pick your aircraft up and set it down and then pick it up and set it down again, that's 2 incidents. That's not 1 flight, that's 2 flights. So you're looking at $45,000 in fines right there. Or my math isn't good, $54,000.
We, by the way, we took one carrier that chose to ignore us, kept flying through New York, and that was multi-millions of dollars.
Skypan. Skypan. So these are enforcement actions. The FAA is indeed enforcing these rules and regulations, and now that they have 107, they have even more teeth to sink into everybody and go after them. So local government is regulators.
All right, we'll go to the next slide here. So one of the, probably the thing that jumps out at me most about this slide, civil penalties for interference with law enforcement. And I think that would, at least my interpretation of that, it would involve public safety as well. I know there have been incidents. We got lots of forest fires in the state where I live, and you get people that are flying unmanned aircraft when you've got helicopters trying to come in and work on the forest fire, and they stop that work until they can clear the airspace. So there are significant issues of public safety involved with inappropriate use of unmanned aircraft when you have a public safety issue underway.
And I recommend you read HR 636. It's really, really impressive legislation. It really helps out public entities such as everybody in the audience here. Here's the wording. The big part about this is these fixed site locations that you can work with the FAA and so if you have, for instance, an amusement park, oil refinery, chemical facilities, like who was talking about, Department of Energy has some concerns. So you can work with the FAA and say, listen, we want these areas to be no-fly zones. And HR 636, Section 2209 is what gives you the opportunity to work with the FAA to go ahead and do this.
And that's the part I talked about, that we're working on getting a rational approach to that. As you can imagine, it'd be overwhelming. Right. Joe's Barbecue wants to be protected. So we're finding a way to get at that. We should know here in the next several months.
So there's going to be a rulemaking on this. So now we have another agency that NTOA needs to be focused on for how these rules are going to come out. And this is really important. And this upcoming rulemaking to interpret the new statute is important, because if you read the Part 7 rules, and I mentioned earlier, they have language in there that preserves local regulatory authority. And now we have this new federal statute that says if you want to prohibit flying over certain sites, there's going to be a process set up where you get FAA approval. Well, what if do we have local authority to prohibit flying over certain sites now, as the 107 rules say? Or now we have this federal statute that says we have to go through this process and ask permission of the FAA first. And it is not completely clear whether you want, if you have an outright preemption now, or prohibition rather, that you want to keep somebody flying over the city's water treatment plant. Is that something you can do now, or do you have to wait till this process comes out and get FAA approval? It is really, really important that your legal counsel carefully review these regulations, and we're at a stage where there's a lot of gray area, and we have to make our best estimate and go forward from that point.
All right, we're going to shotgun these last couple of slides. So other local regulator considerations, Fourth Amendment considerations. Of course, everybody's concerned with privacy. We recommend you read the NTIA best practices. Remember, it's best practices. It is not a law. It is not a regulation. It's a recommendation. However, we do already have laws and regulations in place, such as peeping Tom laws. Those are already in place. It's not the FAA's jurisdiction, right? They're not in charge of peeping Tom laws. So look at what jurisdiction you, or what regulations you already have on the books, like I said, such as nuisance and peeping Tom. The next one, so there are some places that are coming up with federal regulations, or I'm sorry, state and local regulations and ordinances and laws. They are being challenged in court, so this is why we recommend you work with the FAA to ensure that the ordinances that you enact do not violate any federal regulations. Some state legislative trends. A lot of states are enacting legislation. And then some recommended best practices real quick. The big one, if you hire a third-party UAS service company, check your insurance liability on that. You're still held accountable. You're still held liable. So even though the person who you hire to fly says that they have insurance, asked to be a third-party carrier on that insurance policy. Really important.
I can't, you cannot overstate the importance of that. Check with your current insurance carrier, your risk management folks. A lot of our states have insurance pools that insure municipalities and counties. I've already talked to the ones in Colorado and have figured out what kind of language they will require if you're doing this in order to be covered. And many of your states have governmental immunity protections, and you need to make sure when you hire one of these companies you have language in there that's notwithstanding their insurance and the protection that they're providing the city or the county, that you're not waiving any rights under governmental immunity in connection with potential liability. All of those issues are implicated here.
So once again, determine if you're going to be a Part 107 operator, public COA, or hired out third party. Consult with the FAA, right there. That's the big one. If you're going to do anything, consult with the FAA. That's really it for that slide.
Yeah, I mean, there are some local regulatory areas that the FAA has said are okay. So a requirement for law enforcement to obtain warrants before they use UAS for surveillance, and can't use it for voyeurism. No hunting, no shooting weapons from your UAS. Those kinds of things, your local regulations pretty clearly can prohibit, and the FAA will say, yes, that's fine.
Here we go. So drone delivery. That's where, and the cities and counties and municipalities, really drone delivery is what's really gonna affect you at that local level. And so one of the big things that I always recommend is get involved with what's called the NASA Unmanned Aircraft Traffic Management System. At least pay attention to what's going on and be involved in these organizations and committees that are coming up with best practices, especially NASA UTM. That's really going to be important for local and state regulators. Boom.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes for some questions. If you want to step up to the microphone there.
Okay, so this is the first time I hear about the no-fly stuff, which as a guy who wants to go out shooting is worrisome to me. Because if I'll shooting video, not firing
I thought Ken was pretty clear on that, actually.
I know. I mean, I knew, but you know.
The city of Richardson will not be painting skull and crossbones on the side of our drones. So what I got to thinking about there, you're talking about no-fly zones, municipalities setting up no-fly zones in, say, a park. But now I am subject to these rules as an operator. Does this now mean I can't fly my city drone in the park because the city has set up a no-fly zone in the park?
So one of the things that a lot of people have come to my booth and we've talked about them. Remember we said, not only do you need to worry about the laws and the regulations to protect that park and to protect that that fixed site facility, right? Not only do you have to worry about that, but you also need to write legislation that still allows you to monitor that. So you don't want DOE to come out and say, okay, well, we're going to make these no-fly, or nuclear plants a no-fly zone, but then also prohibit DOE from flying over those sites for them to do inspections. So it's this push-pull. So you have to decide, once again, what hat are you wearing? What does your regulation say? And how does that affect you as both the public operator who's monitoring your park, right? You're determining, the growth of your trees or right-of-way or whatever it is that you're looking at within your city, even though it's a no-fly zone for a civil operator. That's the dilemma that we're working with right now.
And the way I would
It's
deal
actually pretty
with
clear.
that as a local government legal counsel is you could probably set up your ordinance that way, where you say these kinds of things are not okay over the park, and these kinds of things are okay over the park. And again, one of those issues that you saw in the presentation that we really can't overstate the importance of it, I would then call the local FAA field office. What are they called? FSDOs.
FSDO,
And
Flight
that-
Service District
We have to
Office.
learn a whole new set of acronyms here. We're done with the telecom stuff, all right? And so I would call my local FSDO and I would say, may I share with you a draft of an ordinance that I'm thinking about suggesting to my city council, and get their feedback on it. But I think you can make the distinguishing.
Hi, Adam Bender with County LA. Epic recently filed a lawsuit against FAA for not developing privacy rules. I'm curious, kind of, what's the effect of that on the plan to have, I guess, local governments kind of develop the privacy rules instead?
Thank you. The last fall, I think it was September of 2015, the president put out a presidential memorandum talking about the concern of privacy, but he clearly assigned it at that time to NTIA, and they went off and worked. There was, frankly, they weren't able to come to conclusion. They had a number of meetings, and the interagency public was involved, and that's when we came out with the best practices. That was the best that they could do. No final definitive answers. As I said, the FAA itself does not see its role in privacy in the purest sense. We are into airspace and safety and aviation. So we enter the discussion from that point, but not from a local ordinance or local law enforcement perspective. So we put the best practices out there. We remind people to do it, with good conscience about how they're going to operate. But in the end, I think a lot of this stuff, as mentioned, will come down to local discussions, probably where it'll be most effective.
Just to follow up, depending on what happens in that lawsuit, I guess, for the other panelists, does that create a risk for city councils, whatever, that are, developing these rules? If the lawsuit comes out one way or the other, does it, affect that?
Yes.
Yeah, it absolutely
The
does.
answer is
But
yes.
By the same token, if there's a need to regulate and there's a gap, there's a void because the feds haven't acted yet, I think it's absolutely appropriate for local governments to step in and address those issues. And to the extent that they feel they can under their local police power, if the court cases come out in a way that says local governments are restricted in this area, then the law will have to change. But to the extent that a city council feels like there's a need in my community to have this kind of protection, and there's not a clear statement in federal or state law as to how you deal with that, it's absolutely appropriate.
Hi, Mike Reardon, City of St. Paul. Just a couple of quick questions. If I understand correctly, I have a staff member who's just dying to get a hold of a UAV and start filming, taping. Shooting, yes. That's why I avoided that, because that's what we say all the time, too. So they need to get a remote pilot's certificate.
They need to register the vehicle, which you can do online. It's pretty straightforward. I think it's still whatever the cost is. It's
$5.
negligible. $5 for 3 years.
$5 for hobbies.
Yeah.
Ah, there you go.
And then yes, they'll have to take and complete the remote pilot certificate. It's a 60-question test. There's test banks in there. Some are, I think we were up to about 3 practice tests and all that. You need to have 70 passing, so 42 questions complete. And then you'll have your vehicle will be registered, and you will be certified to operate. Once, and in there's all the questions about airspace and so on and so forth. So then you will know where you're allowed to operate and how to operate.
Unless you're operating as a public entity. And
Well, that would,
then-
yes, with city.
Then you don't take the Part 107 test, then you self-certify. And that's part of the liability that you're going to have to determine whether or not you want to operate under Part 107, or the city wants to take on a little bit more of the liability and the risk by operating as a public operator. And self-certification is really the big difference between the two. And it's where you certify your pilots, certify your aircraft, certify your medical requirements internally as a public organization.
And obviously, being a public entity, you're going to be held to those standards. So you can do it either way. I mean, former DOD, I had to remind the FAA not once, but more than once, that we could self-certify our vehicle and our operators, and have forever. So you can do that in locally, but what I've found is a lot of the local communities, or law enforcement and otherwise, are going off to service schools, training schools now, to make sure they're hitting a pretty high bar.
Right.
And you know, so.
So what I just heard you say confused me, because if I'm a public entity and he's a public employee, he needs to,
I would argue, the only thing I would maybe clarify with her is, he's doing a public function, not going out and shooting happy snaps. He's a local law enforcement, firefighter, those kinds of things, and it's used in that public mission, if you will, not,
Inherently
hey, you know, I'm a
government
government
operation.
employee, so I don't need to do anything.
Not what he's talking about.
Yeah, he's not talking about law enforcement, he's
No,
talking
I know, I'm
about
saying though.
filming for local, for government television.
Yeah, public entity.
okay, so it's a whole different way of getting the certification. I'm confused now.
So there's two, remember we said, so you can do public operation,
Right,
or you can do 107,
right,
or you can operate under both depending on what you need to do and you need to operate under.
okay.
And that's when I said, that's when you need to decide, what do you want to operate under? Do you want to operate as a public entity and fall under the rules and regulations of 49 U.S. Code 40105 or 40125? Or do you want to strictly operate under Part 107? And each comes with their pros and cons. I have a pros and cons list on my computer I can show you.
Hire a consultant, I guess.
Mike has finally figured out the
Exactly.
purpose of this panel, right?
Mike kind of got some of my question in his
He's
question.
talking to Brandon.
But, you know, I'm kind of curious, is there a,
Guys, hold it down, please.
Guys.
I can't hear the question.
okay, so I'm kind of curious, is there a planned or maybe implemented process for identifying the units, because they're so small? You started talking about markings and and registering. You know, that's great on the big planes, because, you know, probably if they crash, you'll find the markings. You know, these planes, you may not find the pieces that mark that plane. And then you might have an issue about identifying who is the user. And with me being a government entity user or operator or pilot, and I'm in the airspace with maybe private users, is there a possibility that there's a way that maybe we get caught up in a situation where somebody's doing something illegal in the same airspace that we're in, and then we get caught in a lawsuit issue or something of that? Is there any kind of planned effort to really maybe have some kind of sensor on each plane that identifies the plane, so that, you know, that plane's travel
HR
is
636.
identified?
Right.
Yeah, HR 636 has come out with a sort of a requirement to look at a way to identify both the unmanned aircraft system and the operator. And that's where the manufacturers are going to have to diligently work with the FAA, and they have been they've been avoiding this for a long time, but the FAA and industry is trying to figure out, is this going to be an RF tag? How are you going to identify both the aircraft and the operator? Now, we know DJI, one of the things we talk about is kind of a national security concern as well. But when you operate these with your cell phone, a lot of these unmanned aircraft are operated with your cell phone, that data is already there. And if you needed to reach out to DJI, if there was a subpoena for those records, or if there was a court case, something happened and you got sued and you wanted to make sure that wasn't your drone that committed that nefarious act, you could pull those records down from a lot of these unmanned aircraft, from their apps, from your data, and show where you are, where you were, how high you were, where you were operating, and show that data to prevent that. So when you look at what aircraft you're going to purchase for your operation, make sure that you can get that telemetry data to protect you in case there is a lawsuit later on.
All right, second question, this is printed at Ken mostly. Thanks, Ken. You're my
Just-
friend, man. But
Excuse me,
Yeah.
just a point. At this point, we are at the close of this session, but obviously there's some more conversations. Lunch doesn't start for another half hour, and our panelists are in no hurry to go anywhere, so we can continue the conversation. So I know you had some more questions, and feel free, no, come on up.
Yeah, no, come on up. We're
Come
just
on up,
letting
we'll
you know.
keep going.
And real quick,
Just so you know that, we're done, and thank you, but, we're going to keep going as long as we have some time here.
and on the back table, I have some pamphlets with some information. You guys want to grab those on your way out? There's for what you guys have to do, and business cards for that consulting service.
So Ken, this question is try